Good evening. I am the Reverend Allison Buttrick Patton, pastor of Saugatuck Congregational Church, United Church of Christ, which is the white steepled church just over there on the post road. And on behalf of Saugatuck Church and our co-sponsors, Sustainable Westport, Team Westport, and the Westport Library, I am thrilled to welcome you to this evening's Climate Justice Lecture with Rhiana Gunn-Wright. In 2022, our organizations began to talk together about inviting a nationally recognized speaker to help us think about the intersections between the climate crisis and structural racism. We are a community that cares deeply about our ecosystem. We build pollinator pathways, plant native grasses over at Sherwood State Park, reduce plastic, and compost our waste. And Westport has long been a pioneer in sustainability, making progress towards achieving the town goal of becoming a net zero community, thanks to the creative efforts of Sustainable Westport. However, we recognize that environmental impacts cross town borders. We also realize that there is a disproportionate environmental burden borne by communities of color in our region. To achieve a sustainable future in which all people can flourish, we need to begin to think regionally, to take into account the health of our shared land and air and waterways and the well-being of our neighbors in towns and cities all up and down our coast. And so we are delighted that Rhiana Gunn-Wright has agreed to join us tonight to begin that conversation. And we are delighted that you have chosen to join us. Welcome to this conversation. I'd like to invite up Harold Bailey of Team Westport to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Allison. Let me adjust this a little bit. Okay, thanks again, Allison. As Allison said, in effect, when it comes to sustainability, what we tend to do, not just here in Connecticut, but all over the country, is to talk regionally, but act locally. And one of the things we need to do is to have some kind of a mechanism at some point to put together some of our regional neighbors, so we end up with regional goals and regional actions and regional thoughts. It's a different kind of mindset than just taking out the recyclables, having some money in the budget to teach kids about the environment, and so on. And the question is, who can help us? Who's doing some of the leading thought, or coming up with the leading thought in this arena? And tonight, we're really blessed to have Rhiana Gunn-Wright as our speaker to be able to do that. She is the Director of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute, and she heads looking at the research at the intersection of climate policy, public investment, racial equity, and public power. Along with her colleagues, she aims to create a body of work that examines the role of economic policy and large-scale economic transformation in catalyzing just and rapid responses to the climate crisis. Now, prior to joining Roosevelt, she was the policy director for New Consensus, charged with developing and promoting the Green New Deal. She was also the policy director for Abdul El Sayed's 2018 Michigan gubernatorial campaign, and as a Yale graduate and a 2013 Rhodes Scholar. She has also worked as the policy analyst for the Detroit Health Department, acted as the Miriam K. Chamberlain Fellow of Women in Public Policy for the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and served on the policy team for former First Lady Michelle Obama. There are people who do things, and there are people who get things done. There are people who work on problems and people who actually solve them. Tonight, we have a problem solver who gets things done. Rhiana Gunn-Wright.
Okay. Is this good, Travis? Okay. Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor. It's an honor to be here. It's also really cool to visit Fairfield County. Like she said, I went to Yale, and I always heard about Fairfield County, but I never been. This is a nice library. But really, thank you. Everyone I met has been so welcoming and gracious and clearly really invested in these questions about regional partnership and climate justice and sustainability. And I say that because that isn't a given, right? And so to see people working on these issues just as citizens trying to figure it out, it means a lot. And it is really great to sort of step outside of the DC bubble, which is often 10,000 feet view. We talk about things in terms of averages, which is really different than talking about it in terms of people. And so I just am really grateful to be here on this beautiful day in your beautiful community. And I wanted to say ahead of time, forgive me if this is bumpy. If you couldn't tell by my loud outfit, I'm a new mother, and so I have to dress in patterns to feel alive. And my baby just turned 18 months today, and which means he's in a moment where he believes bedtime is his enemy and sleep is for the weak. And so I am decidedly very weak at the moment. But today, we have 45 minutes of me talking, and then we'll have Q&A. But I want to talk to you about three things. 45 minutes isn't a ton of time. So hopefully we cover all of it. But I often come to discussions like this with these three parts, which is how I got into my work in climate policy and climate advocacy, specifically around climate justice, why it's so important to fight for equitable, inclusive climate policy, and beyond that, why and how racial justice is connected to the climate crisis and environmentalism. Environmental justice activists have been talking about that link for decades, but it is a conversation that for a lot of people has just surfaced in the mainstream in the last 4 years, in no small part to the Green New Deal. Okay, pat, pat, pat. But that's to say that, like, I think like a lot of things, it can be in the zeitgeist, but that doesn't always mean people understand the connections or know how these things are tied together. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll end with talking about like ways what little advice I have about how to get involved and also how to start thinking regionally. And this is actually a really good time for that, because if you haven't heard, there's 3 now laws that have passed: the CHIPS Act, which is largely about manufacturing, and a lot of it is about money to bring things like semiconductors and other industries that are connected to clean energy and renewable energy back to U.S. shores. That is a source of funding that, for the most part, communities won't interact with directly. But the other two laws do have sources of funding that communities will interact with directly. One is, people call it IIJA. I can't even remember the long name, but other people call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. So that has money for clean water, brownfield site cleanup, investments, and like electric and fossil fuel powered buses. Gotta love bipartisanship. But things like that. So those sorts of investments. And then the big one that people talk about is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest climate investment that the US has ever made, along the lines of, it'll end up probably being at least $1 trillion, all told, when you have matched private investment with public investment. And a lot of that money is gonna go directly to states, who will then grant it to communities, and some of that money will go directly to communities too, or can be applied directly to communities. So I bring all that up to say, there's a lot of resources in the mix, and because the focus of all of that is largely about making clean energy more accessible, affordable, seeding investment, all the building of clean energy and renewable energy, and just really the transformation of the energy system, which is what a lot of the money is for, that is inherently a regional problem. That's a regional endeavor. There just isn't a way to do that that's not, right? In part because of just the nature of the electric grid. This is getting very nerdy, but we'll talk about that more at the end. But I just wanted to say that, like, this is actually a moment that's right to talk about a regional approach to these issues. And so I'm really excited that this is a moment that you all are talking about it, because citizens having a vision, especially a regional vision of what they want clean energy to look like for them, is really crucial and really important, because otherwise you will have people who are in it not for community making those choices for you. So anyway, so beyond that, I also just wanted to say, just up front, I like to tell people that this might be like a little bit more emotional than your standard climate talk. And I say that because, like, climate and even climate justice, but especially sort of the way we think about environmentalism and the way we talk about the climate crisis is often, despite the fact that it touches millions of people's lives, it can be talked about, and it's often talked about in a really dry scientific way. We're talking about parts per million of CO2, or average global temperature rise, or timelines and deadlines and words like net zero, and all of that is really important. But ultimately, so much, everyone in this fight is shaped by experiences and emotion. And something that I learned working on the Green New Deal is that to be effective in this fight, in a fight for climate justice, or even just basic climate policy, we have to be focused on people, because ultimately this is something that's going to require a lot of changes, both in people's habits on a mass scale, and people are curious and need to know how this will affect their lives and the lives of their community, and the lives of the people that they love. Right? And so I just like to tell you that, you know, in case I start crying, y'all aren't like, what in the is happening? So let's just jump into how I got into climate policy and climate activism. So I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood called Inglewood. I was raised by my mother and my grandmother, and I grew up in the house that my mom grew up in, that at this point my family has owned for nearly 70 years. And the neighborhood that my mom grew up in, the version of Inglewood that she got to sort of blossom in, was not the same neighborhood I grew up in. So my mom would like basically tell all these stories that sounded like Black Leave It to Beaver. We played stickball in the street all night, and grandma used to make hot dogs, and there would be a line out the back door and down the block, and we used to have a dog named Toby who terrorized everybody, and my grandmother drove a station wagon that was so big apparently it looked like a school bus because it was yellow, and she used to like take kids from the neighborhood to school. And the block, like the commercial strip, was bustling, and that's where they bought their school clothes and their groceries and their everything. And it was just this very vibrant, alive, largely safe, as long as you didn't cross the street into the white part of the neighborhood, safe place to be. And by the time I was growing up, Inglewood was mostly known for shootings and poverty, but I still grew up surrounded by a real sense of community. We had known our neighbors at that point for 30 years, right? Like these were people who asked about our report cards and like gave us extra candy if we got A's, and watched me if my grandmother wasn't around in the afternoon and fed me bologna sandwiches, preferably fried. And would like hold the school bus if I wasn't there on time. But because of the disinvestment in my community, because of white flight, because of a lot of things, but essentially that all come back to disinvestment. The schools were getting worse and worse, so my mom kept sending me further and further from my family to get a good education. So it was first to an elementary school across the city, and then to a boarding high school about an hour away, and then finally ending up at Yale for college. And that experience of being part of a community that I love so much, but I was forced away from so that I would have a shot, at least in my mom's estimation, is what essentially drew me to public policy. But I was only interested in like policy that had to do with welfare or poverty, because that was what I saw like shaping the lives of the people in my neighborhood the most, right? And I thought if I can make a change there, maybe other kids won't have my experience. Maybe they can grow up close to their parents and not feel like, oh, I need to forsake this in order to like have a chance at some sort of upward mobility. And I say that to say that, like, it wasn't that I didn't know about environmentalism. When I was at Yale, I knew people who ran divestment campaigns from fossil fuels, but like, none of those people look like me. They were, by and large, white, and almost all of them seem rich. And also, I was in school at a time where like the climate crisis was defined by polar bears and ice caps, and I was like, I'm sad for them polar bears. What they got to do with me? And so I just didn't understand like what fossil fuels had to do with the things that I cared about, and as I got further in my career, I'm working on like student parents, how do we keep single mothers in college and have their welfare officers allow them to go to college as a work requirement instead of making them quit and go do some dead-end CNA job somewhere. And so I'm like, what am I gonna tell these people about solar panels? Like, folks can't get child care. Like, what are we doing? And so, and that's the mindset that I had for a lot of my early career until I went to Detroit. So I moved to Detroit like 2016, and I went to work as a policy analyst at the city's health department. And that was the first time I actually learned about environmental justice. Detroit is like a hotbed for environmental justice issues. When I was there was an incinerator in the middle of the city, and the neighborhoods around, kids had like 5 times the statewide rate of asthma. And 80% of the trash that was burned there came from wealthier suburbs. But because of the deal the city made when they sold the incinerator, residents were still paying for it. So residents were actually paying to, some of the trash that was burnt was there, but they were paying higher rates for it. And then they were also paying to have other people's trash burnt and poison their children. It was the Flint water crisis was still being resolved. There were residential neighborhoods near oil refineries, a steel mill. There was a new bridge that was going to be built from Canada to Detroit with tons of truck traffic, again, into an area that was near oil refineries. So you're talking about just like pollution on pollution. And then also the city was bulldozing a lot of homes that were in tax foreclosure, often illegally, because the city didn't reassess the homes purposefully because they would lose revenue if they assess those homes as zero, and both the city and the county sort of relied on those foreclosures because they come with a lot of fines and whatnot. And they were bulldozing those homes, and those homes were often older, and so that means like whatever lead is in the house is now dust. It's like going around the neighborhood, getting deposited in the soil. And residents weren't always informed before, so kids are outside playing while this is going on. And so I had never connected. I never heard of environmental justice. I still remember the first day I heard the term sacrifice zones and learned about the fact that, at least in Detroit, and this is the case across the US, facilities would be purposefully placed in poor Black neighborhoods, polluting facilities, with an understanding, both because it's cheaper to locate there because of zoning, but also because companies knew that it was harder for those communities to fight back, and they would exploit that. And seeing the connections to the health impacts, right? You have, like I said, you have higher levels of asthma, you have higher levels of heart disease, maternal mortality. We had such issues with maternal and infant mortality, low birth weight, cancer, mysterious cancers. I remember talking to one woman who is an activist around the neighborhood by the refinery, and it was something she would talked about, like 7 people on her block that just came up with cancer, so that they couldn't defined. She would talk about having to sleep in like a respirator, a mask at night because the smells were so strong that they would wake her up and she couldn't breathe. Right? All of that's going on, and seeing the connection really moved me. And then I think the thing that happened next was so impactful for me in my life. I thought about what I was hearing, and for the first time, I realized that like I might have lived in a frontline community. I had asthma growing up to the point that every spring from like 4th to 8th grade, I had to be out of school because I would get bronchitis so bad in the spring. And my mom was a single mom, and she ran her own nonprofit, and so juggling that, I just remember how difficult that was for her and for us. And I didn't even realize asthma was so common in my neighborhood. We thought of it as a childhood disease that you would just grow out of. So many people, kids on my block had asthma, and I wasn't even the worst. I knew kids who would be in the emergency room multiple times a year, missing out on who knows how much school because they were sick. That thing going to look up the data and realize that I was from one of the most polluted communities in Chicago was, I don't know if I've ever felt more worthless than that day. I could have died. I could have been chronically disabled. Who knows what could have happened? And to know that someone, more than one someone, many someones in power knew this, but thought that kids like me and people like me were disposable enough that like if we were the price of business, that was just what it was. I don't know how to describe to someone what that feels like. It was like in an instant I went from being a person to a pawn. And to know how hard my mother worked to try to give me the best life, and know she had no idea what was in our air and why what was happening to me was happening. It's heartbreaking, and I bring that up because I feel like often, like I said, with climate justice, we talk about it in a way where sometimes it's easy to miss that like this is creating real trauma for real people on an individual level. Right? Like, I couldn't really run as a kid. I was already the chubby kid. Do you want to be the chubby kid who can't breathe? That's humiliating. And all I wanted to do was run and like be an athlete. That stuff stays with you. I'm like 34 now and trying to be like, I'm going to, I don't know, run several miles. Absolutely not, I hate running, but that's not the point. The point is I'm like trying to rediscover that part of myself now at my big age, right? Because I have the resources that I do, but not everybody gets that do-over, right? And I say that because I think it's just really important to understand that environmental injustice is like inflicting trauma on all sorts of people and not knowing where that's gonna end up, and we have to take that seriously. In a lot of ways, it's like acting like God. You just get to traumatize a bunch of people. You just get to throw whatever in their lives, and then what? It doesn't disappear. They live with that. And so I just say that because I think it's just really important, like I said, to keep that perspective in mind. And so essentially, like learning all that, getting incredibly pissed off about it, and having worked in Detroit already, I did start to see how it was connected. Because like I said, it was by design, like housing laws, zoning laws, redlining, residential segregation, right? That was all a big reason why poor Black and brown communities are more likely to be zoned industrial, even if there's residential neighborhoods around, why it's cheaper to settle there, why like the history of disenfranchisement in the US and systemic racism, the history of people of color not being believed, all of that also plays a part in why those facilities are located where they are. And of course, also like the way the state and courted and invested in corporations, the way pollution laws are enforced or not enforced, right? All of that plays a role, and in a lot of ways, a lot of these things are by design, and things are only getting worse with climate change, right? Hotter summers mean that it's more important than ever to have access to water and cooling systems, right? But urban areas, a lot of inner city neighborhoods, there's not greenery, right? They're called urban heat islands because essentially there's so much concrete that they just bake in the heat. It's hotter there, literally, even as people are more likely to have their utilities shut off, to not be able to afford AC, right? Also, heat exacerbates air pollution, so it makes asthma worse. It makes asthma attacks worse. And at the same time, at least say in the case of Detroit, you have those same refineries or industries or facilities that don't want to comply with pollution reporting or mitigation efforts. They also don't want to cut their emissions, right? They want to keep their business model as is. And so that is just in this instance, although in Detroit, in Chicago, but also on the broader scale in the US, that's just one set of examples of how all of this is linked. So, sorry, I lost my place. I'm sorry, just thinking a little bit about, if I'm being honest, it's always hard to get over the part talking about being from a frontline community. It's just, I just wish that experience on no one. But with that in mind, why don't we go ahead and talk about like why and how. So we talked a little bit about how racial justice and climate justice are connected. And I think it's important when thinking about those connections to also talk about like why it's important to have climate policy that recognizes and acknowledges and addresses those connections, because what you'll hear even now, I heard it a ton when we first started working on the Green New Deal, but you'll hear it even now where people be like, why can't you just deal with climate change? Right, like why do you have to bring in this extra element? Why do you have to talk about race right now? And hopefully some of the examples I gave were illustrative, but essentially there is no way to talk about the climate crisis without talking about race. You're not adding an extra dimension, you're just acknowledging the dimension that already exists, right? So there is no just dealing with climate change. That just actually doesn't exist. You can have policies that appear to just deal with climate change, but essentially all you're doing is just ignoring the other stuff and say relying on technical solutions or talking about clean energy without talking about who owns that energy, who benefits from that energy, right? So essentially you're just answering part of the question, but the rest of the question doesn't disappear. And so one way I like to explain the connections to people is by talking about our world as a body. That is a model that comes from a sociologist at Columbia called Jedediah Purdy. He talks a lot about the world being a body and society being a body. And if that's the case, then our energy systems, or our sources of energy, in this case, what we currently have largely as fossil fuels, those are our food. Right? And so how many people in here have ever like gone vegetarian or vegan or paleo or Whole30 or a fair number of people? It changed how you structure your life, right? I'm like currently trying to eat less sodium for my heart or whatever. And like, it is startling the number of things that I'd like noticed now that I never noticed before, or that I have to think about or maneuver around. Like I had to change, you have to change how you cook. You have to change maybe where you shop, what restaurants you go to, what you order, what family dinners are like, maybe how close you sit to a bathroom. There's a lot of things going on. And the point is that when you change what you eat, your life changes, your body changes. And it has to, and society is no different. When we change the source of our energy, we change the shape of our world in so many ways. And the shift from being on fossil fuels to renewable, clean energy is way bigger than just becoming vegan, right? You're essentially going from eating oil to eating like sun and wind and the force of running water, things that are very beautiful but are very different than burning coal, right? It requires a different amount of land. It requires a different electric grid, right? It requires literally changing how we send energy back and forth, right? It can mean, you've probably heard a ton about gas stoves and electric stoves, right? It means changing the inside of your home. It means changing materials that we build with. It means changing the type of cars that we have. And it's easy to be like, oh, okay, EV versus, even in the case of electric vehicles, an electric vehicle basically is a battery with wheels. So think about all the downstream changes. You don't need auto shops like that. All of those secondary producers that make parts, for, what are they gonna make now? They can be changed, but right, there's just not, it's different. How we structure traffic and traffic laws, EVs are way heavier than internal combustion engine vehicles, which means, unfortunately, the risk of fatality if you are hit goes way up, especially if you're talking about like an electric F-150. That thing is a behemoth, right? So that really might change the way speed limits, right? Traffic laws, because we want to keep people safe. And so it's less like going from like eating meat to not eating meat to like eating food to now eating like red algae, right? Like it is just a big change. And say if we ate red algae, that also now algae farmers are incredibly rich, right? Like the shipping routes change, how we store stuff. And that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. And that's why I say questions about who owns, who benefits, all of those are really important, and particularly important to climate justice, because our current system both hurts first and worst people of color, but those people are also a lot less likely to benefit, right? They're a lot less likely to own resources, energy resources. They're a lot more likely to live in energy inefficient homes, right? And so the point of asking who benefits is to say that if we have what feels often like a once in a lifetime opportunity to rework these systems, there's not often where you have to go in and essentially engineer and design an economic system, which is exactly what you have to do if you have an energy transition. If you're gonna have to essentially not even just pop the hood and change something, but disassemble the car and rebuild it, why not build it better? Why not build something that is more just and more equitable? And that answers the questions of who owns, who benefits, who runs differently. Right? And I say that, and it's not just like a nice to have sort of thing. It actually, if we do that, it will actually have beneficial effects on the climate crisis and the climate change and our ability to limit warming and prevent something like this from happening again. Because I'm just here to disabuse you. If you thought that like we have like 20 years and we'll deal with climate change and then we'll just move on, false. We have unleashed a set of things that will be with us, in some cases, forever. This is, essentially what I'm saying is this is a long-term problem that is it better? This is a long-term problem that we're gonna have to manage. And so having a more equitable economy, at the very least, creates fewer hiding places. Fewer places where you can poison people without consequence, which is exactly what we have now, and which I would argue is a really big reason that the fossil fuel industry has flourished, right? Because fossil fuels are inherently poisonous. We have known this for over 100 years. Right? You have Thomas Edison talking about the benefits of renewable energy versus fossil fuels and how he hoped that how using fossil fuels when we could do renewable energy is like living like a renter on Earth when you don't have to, right? So we've known about this for a long time. People have been getting sick for a long time. But if everyone had to deal with those effects equally, do you think we would still be burning fossil fuels without consequence and without limit? No offense if there was an incinerator in the middle of Westport. Oh, okay. That's not great because incinerators shouldn't be anywhere, but I get you. They shouldn't be, yeah, we just need, anyway. But I get you, but that's exactly it. When you even think about the Dakota Access Pipeline, that was initially routed to go through Bismarck. Bismarck is 99% white. They had a series of town hall meetings, and developers rerouted it through indigenous land, even though they were breaking treaties. But that's what white supremacy, systemic racism allows you to do. And now look at how indigenous folks and allies had to fight. People were getting gas, tear gas, beat, all sorts of things. Bismarck had to have a few meetings, right? And so having a more equitable economy where ownership is more equitable, all of those things, to me, those just create safeguards against the same sorts of pockets or systems of exploitation that we have now. And also on a foundational level, inequality drives up emissions. Countries with higher levels of income inequality, especially if they're rich, have higher emissions. There's a study that in New York, even a city with incredibly high density, which people say should be beneficial in terms of reducing pollution, reducing, right, use of cars. Emissions weren't lower largely because higher income people still had a much larger carbon footprint because they could afford to. And so that is just, I think, more evidence of why inequality, inequity allows the sort of excesses in a system that have driven the climate change that we see now. And so I will also say that, like, it matters too because having to come up with solutions where no one is exploited is a skill set that we don't have that we need to build, right? Like, so in the case of renewable energy, how many of you have heard of something called permitting reform? Thank God, you're blessed. But essentially, the IRA, this big climate investment, is unleashing a lot of money, largely, overwhelmingly directed to the private sector to incentivize them to build clean energy, right? And the issue, though, is that one of the big issues is that we don't have transmission lines, enough transmission lines to actually electrify everything, right? We don't have the lines that would carry, say, the energy from a new solar farm to anywhere. We don't have it. Our electric grid is really old. Utilities basically own all of our transmission lines, private utilities, because most utilities are private, investor-owned. They don't make money from investing in that. They don't. So we have like a grid that needs help, essentially. And if we don't build enough transmission lines, we could lose out on something like 80% of the reductions in emissions that the bill could achieve. So there is a push for something called permitting reform. Now, part of what particularly fossil fuel industries, but also a lot of sort of progressive energy experts were pushing for was also gutting the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, which is one of the main really legal, I wouldn't even say legal frameworks, but laws that frontline communities can go to push back against polluting infrastructure, or in the case of tribes, infrastructure, even if it's clean energy infrastructure, that raises sacred lands without any consultation, right? And so a big push happened to like basically gut NEPA in a way that prevented and prevents judicial challenges, puts time limits, like reduces how in-depth the study is, allows industry to do their own studies instead of the government and then just submit them as though they are impartial. All of that is going on. And essentially, the argument that I've heard a lot of people make really is about railroading. It's about sort of how do you reduce community input, because some folks have decided that that is what slows down projects. How do you prevent communities from being able to come forward with challenges? And that's the way we're gonna speed it up. There's a lot of other things you can do just around transmission. But I say that because that sort of railroading is right from the playbook of systemic racism. That's how we built highways, eminent domain. That's how we've built a lot of our infrastructure. And that's what we're trying to do again at a moment where our democracy is so fragile, where there's already right-wing groups who are putting out disinformation about solar and wind, and already talking about, look at how big solar is like gonna come in and crush you. And where, quite frankly, a lot of the land that we need to use is in the hand of private landowners who do not have to give that up. And those landowners are mostly white. But again, because we don't have another playbook but sort of oppress and exploit, we haven't, and because we're not in at least a moment where a ton of people are taking seriously the idea of how do we come up with solutions that don't exploit people, this is the toolbox that we have. And that is really troubling, especially for sort of the long-term health of a clean energy transition, because you can't railroad your way into everything. Especially not when people have to give you voluntary leases on their land, and there's no way around that. So I just bring that up because I think even beyond the very sort of direct effects on emissions, there's other effects on just the ways that we think about policy, the ways that we go about trying to come up with solutions, and what we think of as a good solution, what qualifies as a good, acceptable solution. And quite frankly, the idea that you deal with climate change and later you can deal with climate justice, it just doesn't work like that. How we distribute money, how we distribute power in the transition will decide the political economy we have in a green, sort of our green future. And if we have a green economy that's as stratified as the one we have now, we will have failed, and we will likely continue to fail. Because there are not enough Black people to throw between us and the sun. There just aren't. And the amount of land that you need just for renewable energy means land use conflicts on a level and with groups that we have not encountered. And when we have laws and systems that essentially seek success in part by exploiting folks without a lot of capital, like I've been trying to talk about, it leaves us without a lot of tools for when people do have that capital. And they can stand up, which is what is actually happening in a lot of rural areas with solar power. We're running into these conflicts and people literally don't know how to manage them. They don't know where to go next. And so that's why the Green New Deal is about climate, jobs, and justice. And that is a big part of why I truly believe that climate policy, we cannot have an effective response to the climate crisis without also thinking, not even thinking, but actually addressing environmental injustice long term. And the last thing I'll say about that before we transition into like what do we do, is that climate change is already creating and will continue to create an increasingly resource-constrained world that it will literally be soaked in scarcity. We're talking about less food, less water. I don't know if you read about the Colorado River, right? And having to essentially divvy up how water's coming out of the Colorado River so it doesn't go dry. Like, that's not the first time that will happen. State Farm is refusing to insure more homes in California because of wildfire risks. Right, so like insurance is even a commodity that is becoming scarcer and more expensive, especially in coastal communities like yours. And And so that means that we're gonna need community more than ever. But for that to happen, we need policies that help to create environments where we feel safe enough to be generous and kind and empathetic. And that's another reason why you have to address environmental injustice and racial injustice, because as long as people can always look over their shoulder and know what it means, what life can really look like if you're not protected in this country, under the law, if the law doesn't respect you, how vulnerable you are to poverty, then it's a lot harder to make those changes, right? But if we have a more equitable economy that's just softer and easier on people, I actually think that you could see attitudes, it might really be easier to change attitudes. Because a lot of what we see, listen, I'm not an oracle, but I think a lot of people would agree, a lot of it is fear. So I think that, again, it's just another reason. Now, sorry, my phone almost died, so I have no idea what time it is. Oh my God, okay, goodbye. In your questions, I will answer what you all should do. I'm so sorry, you all were so nice for no one to be like, hey lady. But yes, if someone wants to ask what to do, happy to answer.
If anyone has a question, we ask that you come to this microphone over here. That way the recording will actually ask your question and everyone will be able to hear you.
Good evening, thanks. What a great talk, and you're inspiring, and wish you the best of luck. So.
Oh, thank you.
This might be off topic, but
No.
when you were starting to talk about the vegan thing, I started to think about, is there an opportunity in the work that you do, or do you spend any time thinking about how we can serve urban areas with vertical farming to solve both the environmental problem and the food desert issue? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm not an agricultural expert, and I say that because I feel like there's so much that goes into that. So I don't work on vertical farms, but I do think all of that is promising and important. The question I always have is like, I think it's always important though to talk to urban communities and residents there, like how high is that on their priority list if they're not interested in vertical farms right now because they got other things going on. I think it's more important to support, say like, if the main goal is trying to shut down an incinerator, but food justice is really important and will grow and will only get more important. So I think that things like vertical farms, teaching folks about that, helping people set those up, I think that's really important. But again, like I said, I just think it has to be up to people where that fits on their list of priorities. I want a vertical farm. Can anyone teach me how to vertical farm?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation today. I was wondering if you could talk about your thoughts on the intersection of policy and financing. I think a lot of the barriers that we're seeing in the transition to clean energy economy and future and ownership has to do with access to capital for communities of color, individuals of color. And can you talk about any thoughts you have or where you see policy going to break that barrier down?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll answer it in two parts. I will be honest. So in the IRA, there's something called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is essentially, it's not a national green bank, but it's like meant to act as federal funding for green banks across the country and communities. And so that is one example, like money from that is overwhelmingly targeted to communities of color and frontline communities. And so that is one form of financing that aims at trying to close that gap. There's also, I'll spare you the nerdy details, something called direct pay, which essentially takes tax credit for renewable and clean energy products or projects, and essentially makes it function as a grant so that public entities and community groups can access it and pay for something like up to 71% of a project, and that can be community solar. And I think there's there's environmental justice block grants. No one knows what those are going to do, but like there's a smattering of these sort of financial pots or pots of finances and resources. Overall, though, I would say there's actually not a ton of thinking about, at least on the federal policy level, serious thinking about types of financing. The IRA is overwhelmingly tax credits, which is very limiting, and the individual tax credits aren't even refundable. So you have to have tax liability to even qualify, which cuts out something like 30% of Americans, low-income Americans. And even if you can access the tax credits, you have to have upfront capital. And for the most part, federal policy right now is just shying away from, except for the instances I mentioned, the ideas, the goal is to incentivize private investment, but there's not a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of interest, but like there's not much happening in terms of thinking about public grants or giving directly to communities, which is the best way to sort of close that gap. There's not a lot of thinking, and then there's the issue of like renters, right? Because renters, why would you put solar panels on a house that you're renting? You might not even be allowed, but landlords don't have the incentive to do that because they don't pay the utility bills, right? So that's a split incentive, and that's a big deal because over half of Americans rent. And that's just something that so far hasn't been taken seriously on the federal level. So I will say there are definitely groups and places thinking deeply, but federal policy doesn't reflect really a lot of thought about it. Does that make sense? Yeah. But financing and types of financing is incredibly important. So I'll just give you an example. Even with those tax credits, there's two big federal tax credits that fund renewable energy. Even with those tax credits, which private industries largely access, they require often something called tax equity investors because solar developers often don't have the tax liability to fully benefit from the projects. But what that means is that essentially Wall Street has a big role to play in choosing what projects get picked because they're the tax equity investors and they're interested in like what's going to give them the biggest return fastest, which means that now Wall Street is having a say in what projects get built or don't get built. And of course, they're not particularly interested in projects in like urban communities that help communities but don't make money. So like that's just an example of how financing matters. It might not, if all of it was direct pay, which it has been in the past at points, it could be different, but that's just for everyone, if that's helpful, to understand sort of like why financing matters, because it does decide who is in the room, who's at the table, who's deciding the type of financing.
I have a question. If you don't mind circling back to the next steps that you were about to talk about.
Yeah.
Could you go into that for a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So I was gonna say a few things. One is excuse me, I know we're talking about climate, but I think it's important to not define climate too narrowly, because climate is really connected to everything. So work on voting rights and democratic processes and reforms is really important to climate change, right? Because who votes decides who gets elected, decides what's happening, and people of color are often like more likely to vote on climate change, more likely to care, more likely to be pro-climate policy, sort of on the whole when they're surveyed. And so voting right, that disenfranchising people of color actually makes climate action harder. If the electorate looks different, what we can do looks different. So I say that police violence, I don't know if you follow what's happening in Cop City in Atlanta, right? A lot of that, one of the protesters, well, I think the only protester that's been killed was a forest defender, right? Because there's environmental justice activists taking action against Cop City because it would raise ecologically important land and burden communities that don't need additional police presence, right? And also, cops are being deployed more often against climate protesters. There's already laws on the books that in some states have outlawed protesting near fossil fuel facilities. I mean, you have people getting charged. I think someone was charged for like treason before, right? So the state, like police are gonna have an increasing presence, especially as we likely have more climate refugees. So I just say that to say that like, all of these things are connected. So if you aren't getting super excited about recycling or something that you think of as traditionally environmental, you should feel free to work on other issues as long as you see the connection to climate and can articulate that to other people, right? I think the other thing that I would say is, especially as you're thinking about regional activism, I think it's important and would be really great to talk to your elected officials about what is their vision for clean energy in Connecticut and in your region. Are there projects that are being slated for around here? Are there projects that you would like to be slated for around here, right? All of that's, I think, that's important because that is a really big focus right now. And often, like I said, decisions about this, part of it's about where transmission lines are and where projects should be put. But more often than not, communities don't necessarily know what projects are on the books. Or is your state courting new facilities with this CHIPS money? Are those new facilities, right, are they gonna have community benefits agreements? Right? How are they going to impact environmental justice communities? All of that, I think, is a really good opportunity to join with neighboring cities and groups to understand, to both come up with a vision, but also to understand what's in the works and what you want to have a say on. And then I would say the thing that I always tell people is seek out environmental justice groups. Environmental justice is not a new field. Groups have been fighting, especially local groups, for decades usually, and they know they often have more sight line on what projects are being proposed, what's going on. And so I think especially with a community like Westport where there are so many resources, it is really important to talk to communities, say, in Bridgeport or New Haven or Stamford, right, about what are the environmental justice fights that they are fighting and how can you funnel resources, privilege, whatever their way, while also still keeping them as the leaders, right? But I do think that that there are fights going on even if you don't know about them. So find out about them and figure out how you can leverage what you have to support them without necessarily taking the reins. But again, I think that regional piece about what is the energy transition gonna look like for you. Also, find out what your utilities are doing. Utilities are a big player in this, and they like to pretend that they are not. But they are often big players, and utilities like play a role in bringing solar, even if it's from a private developer, bringing solar farms or wind farms online. So like really getting, excuse my French, getting in your utilities' ass about what is happening is really important. How, and even down to like, do you have an energy efficiency program and where is that money going? Right, because we found out that some utilities are using money they're supposed to use to provide energy efficient funding or utility funding or not utility funding, but like bill assistance, right? To actually run campaigns against renewable energy. I don't think that's a utility here, but I don't know what your utilities are up to. So that's another, and that's often, I think, can be a regional priority, but really putting pressure on your utility to see where they are on clean energy, what are their plans, right? And are they being obstructive? And really pushing on them and having a say, because they are huge players and often just really fly under the radar. And also asking utilities if they have, and pushing for, and I mean, I don't know if you could design it in your community, sure, but utilities, do they have plans for helping to connect frontline low-income communities to clean energy? Because they can play a role there too. There are things that they can do in terms of billing, in terms of other things, in terms of helping people get access to community solar if that's online, right? There are things that they can do, but asking if they have any plans about how to help close that gap, which they probably don't. And then working with community members to figure out, people from other communities in your region to figure out what would y'all like that plan to be? And can you push for them to adopt that or at least create pressure? And the last thing I'll say is just create pressure constantly. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where there's a lot of powerful incumbents and what they respond to is pressure. Pressure. Be creating pressure constantly. Even if it seems like you're losing, keep creating pressure, because that's the only way anything gets done. And a community like Westport creating pressure, that's pressure people respond to. So, especially if you can bring that pressure behind environmental justice communities, help them figure out, or like work with them to figure out how you can best create pressure. But that's the last thing I'll say, create pressure constantly. It does not matter who says you're in the way or you're stupid or you're making things harder, whatever. They just want you to shut up so they can do whatever they want anyway. So just create pressure.
Thank you so much for highlighting the importance of voting rights, democracy, and collective action and the political nature of this fight. I live in Bridgeport, and it's an election year for mayor, so we know we're like in the thick of it. And the things that we look to is where is it being done well? So, you know, like Connecticut is so small, we're so segregated. The inequality, this is like ground zero for the biggest inequality in the country. So where are the bright spots for you at that 10,000 foot view? Where in the country is it working, and what does good leadership look like? A voter going to the polls
in our Democratic primary in September might want to ask that question. Thank you.
Yeah. So a few things. So something I'm really excited about is New York State just passed the Build Public Renewables Act, which requires the state to essentially build public power where utilities are failing. And that's something that I didn't mention. Public power, so when we work on public power, we mean often the power of the government, but actually publicly owned power, electricity, is could play a really big role in helping to make our energy system more equitable. Because right now it's largely investor owned. But that bill was successful because of organizers, state legislators, they got their national legislators on board. And I think that that's really exciting, and I hope that other places can do something similar. Something else, Minnesota just passed a whole slate of great laws, including around climate. And that was local groups, not dissimilar to the ones here, who've just been like working on the issue for a long time, and both, there's an org called Fresh Energy there that has been really central. I don't know a ton of the lessons from Fresh Energy directly, but I do know that they seemed at least very successful in creating sort of regional community partnerships. And that seemed to be a key to their success. So I think Minnesota and Fresh Energy can be an example of sort of what does a campaign statewide, maybe a little bit long-term look like. And also I think looking at the laws that they pass to see if there's any that you would want to emulate. And then I think the other thing that's been really heartening to me is the number of cities trying to pursue their own Green New Deals. So Boston, I think they just, I forget how much money it was, but they just authorized funding for like green low income and mixed income housing on a level that I haven't seen those sort of public investments from other cities. I know Chicago, their new mayor is going to be pursuing a Green New Deal. LA had one, I don't know how much they moved on it, but I do think those examples of what like locally, how people are translating a Green New Deal into their local context, and then having municipal leaders move on that and lead on that is, I find something really heartening. And the Boston example I feel like it's not the only fruition, but I thought that housing example was really exciting.
Hi. I was wondering if there's a way to make federal agencies accountable for the monies that they've already designated for energy and environmental infrastructure. There's a situation in Connecticut, right, where the federal government actually gave monies for a project. And they signed a contract where they asked the state to administer the program.
Yeah.
The program has not been administered efficiently, and there's a strong chance that the funding for the EJ community will be completely lost. Now, when you're talking about life in a highly segregated state like Connecticut, then there's already a barrier that EJ communities can't pass in order to advocate in their behalf.
Yeah.
What would have been really helpful is if the federal government, the federal agency that delegated the responsibility for these funds to the state had some way built in a way that residents, taxpayers, the community it was supposed to benefit
Yeah.
could appeal,
Yeah.
what do we do?
Honestly, it's really difficult. So sometimes there are things called clawback mechanisms, or like built into the law. If you don't use this money, we will claw it back, we will take it back. But that is rare, and it's even rarer that they actually do it. And so, for the most part, there aren't great tools. Once the money goes out, the federal government, I mean, they tend not to watch it. And I think what they think is that, like, if it's used poorly, then those politicians will be dealt with in like elections, right? Or they'll face electoral consequences. I mean, that's what from what I see, that's the mechanism that they seem to think will most be used, but there's not really, at least to my knowledge, any way to make them accountable, especially if there isn't a clawback there. But again, that's actually it's something that I haven't worked on a ton, but I am actually really passionate about. Most of the time from the federal government, states are the grantees, and they're not always the best grantees. That's not to say, I think I'm a big believer in government, that's not to say that, but that is to say that we haven't really thought through a way to bring in communities and residents either as grantees or to just hold people accountable. Like, that is just a box that folks haven't even delved into. So unfortunately, I can't think of anything I could tell you to get that money back. The best thing I could say is, depending on the federal agency, there's sometimes state or regional offices, like EPA often has state or regional offices, and they, at least to get someone to look into it, you can make noise there and sometimes have more success.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry.
It's right up here. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Johanna Martel. I'm one of the co-directors of Sustainable Westport, which is a nonprofit organization here in Westport. We are one of the co-sponsors of tonight's event, along with Team Westport, the Westport Library, and Saugatuck Congregational Church. I just wanted to thank Ms. Gunn-Wright for that inspirational speech and talk, and thank you for starting this conversation in this community and sharing your journey to environmental justice. Sustainable Westport's mission is to support, inspire, and connect Westport residents, businesses in the town of Westport, in support of the town's own resolution to use best efforts to become a net zero community by 2050 or earlier, or sooner rather. And though we are a really local organization, we realize that real climate solutions need to extend beyond Westport to the region, to the state, and beyond. And that's because what we do here in Westport impacts other communities, as we've discussed. And real solutions, as Ms. Gunn-Wright said, really need to be equitable and just, and recognize our common humanity if they're gonna be successful. So if you guys are interested in continuing this conversation, we're not sure exactly what that will look like, but please sign up. We have a sign-up sheet in the back there. And it doesn't matter if you're from Westport or a neighboring town or from an organization that's particularly interested in environmental justice. We look forward to reaching out to all of you. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Have a good night.